Thank you very much for coming today and for making it to the interview, and for also taking your time in the pandemic to give us an interview on your work. Maybe to start the whole conversation first, you could just tell us a little bit about your work and what you do.
I basically became an independent curator. I was far too experimental, and I was never interested in climbing the ladder and becoming the director of one institution and then a museum and then another museum. And I also, which is important I think here, I never felt at home being the representative of one culture. So I'm not a representative of the British art scene. I'm not a curator of British art, nor of French art, nor of Austrian art, nor of African art, God forbid, right? If I have a specialism, it's that all my work is about creating a productive conflict between the interdisciplinary and the intercultural. So I've been working like that, setting up, for example, a project not unlike maybe the Academy in Exile. It was called Future Academy. I did it on all 5 continents, and it was run by students in architecture, informatics, fine art, design, who were pitching their ideas for a future institute that would allow for autonomous, independent research. And so we looked at the question of structure, we looked at the question of finance, we looked at architecture, and of course we looked at epistemology. What would we teach, what would be taught in an art college in 50 years from now? And given that I wouldn't be around, that the students would be getting on, they'd be also getting older, it felt in line to ask them about the future of an art institution. So that's what I did, and then at the age of 50 I thought, wow, I've been doing a lot of traveling, I've been doing networks before the internet, and now during the internet I produced a journal, a publication series called Metronome. I was twice in the Documenta. I was always borderline, so people didn't know if I was a curator or a publisher or an artist or an academic. And then at one point when I was 50, I thought, okay, I need to actually run an institution. I want to offload the knowledge and the experience I have. And I was offered different posts, but they didn't come to fruition. And then suddenly there was a position going in Frankfurt in a, what they call here, Völkerkunde museum, so a museum of anthropology or ethnology. And I thought to myself, okay, if I want to develop a new type of institution, I had just done 7 years of Future Academy, so I was raring to go, then maybe the most complex museum that exists today is one that is founded on the plundered objects from other cultures. And to work with the collection and to try and reframe the collection to make it accessible is what I did over 5 years in Frankfurt. Eventually I incurred the wrath of the custodians. I was fired. I took the city of Frankfurt to court. I won the court case. And then I was brought to Berlin by the Wissenschaftskolleg, the Institute of Advanced Study, which is a counterpart to the Academy in Exile. Yeah. And they said, write a book about what happened, which I did. It came out last summer, called The Metabolic Museum. And since then, I've remained independent. In other words, I do teaching jobs, I'm guest professors in different places, and I am now associate curator at KW Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin, working on something which we'll talk about at the end, which is the Metabolic Museum University.
Maybe we could also speak about how museums in the West have these collections of objects that came from other places and from other parts of the world that are not the West. Maybe you could explain us quickly how these objects were acquired.
Yeah. So this fits in quite neatly with my biography because I worked on the constitution of the French Musée de l'Homme. Before it was called the Musée de l'Homme. So we're talking late 1920s. So let's just take the French example. I'd like to talk about the German example and then also a little bit about the British. Come back to the British later on with the question of the Benin Bronzes. In the case of the French, the French started really getting involved in collecting. I mean, collecting always goes on. We never think that it begins with colonialism. It begins, of course, with empire. It begins in the 15th century. But the real high point was maybe the 17th century in France. And it was in particular at the beginning of the 20th century, after the First World War, that this is all over Europe, right? That one starts to want to consolidate new structures, new museological structures. And so if you take the French situation between 1926 and 1942, approximately, they went on 40 missions to collect objects from all over the world. I'll explain more as to why when I speak about the German condition, but this was obviously connected to expansionism, to exploitation of the colonies. If you were in, let's say, Côte d'Ivoire and Ivory Coast, then you needed to know how people ticked, how they thought, how they, what belief systems they had, but also how they lived, how they used the land. So all this information that was gathered by anthropologists was to enable a better exploitation, a more effective exploitation of the other. Now, in the case of the French, they had a particular idea in their heads. They thought that the object was a condensation of culture. So when you're talking about, say, the famous mission Dakar-Djibouti, which crossed from Dakar to Djibouti over 2 years, they brought back 3,500 objects for the rather slim collections on Africa in Paris. And they did endless recordings, audio recordings, they made films, they took photographs, and they did this under extreme conditions, right? I mean, threatening people. There are crazy stories around this mission Dakar-Djibouti, which I could tell you, but it would take us too far. But they still had this idea that the object contained some kind of secret knowledge. And the director of the expedition of the Mission Dakar-Djibouti was effectively a military aviator who believed that if you, for example, would hang off the edge of a cliff and look down onto a village, you would be able to map the indigenous mind, right? He also believed that an informant, as they were called, was always hiding something. And so you had to work like a detective. It's actually quite an unpleasant idea that the dialogue always had this notion behind it that you would be holding something back that was the most important. Okay, so this is how the French colonial museums were developed. We'll come back to the French situation when we talk about the present, and talk about the contemporary. In the case of the Germans, it's more complex because Germany has a very ambivalent relationship to its own colonial past. It's being raised at the moment, but there is, for example, very little discussion around the relationship between the development of anthropology and ethnology, let's say in particular from the mid to late 19th century, through to the NS period, the period of National Socialism and Fascism, and what the impact is of early ethnology on the development of racist theory, or how scientific racism infiltrates colonial development, which then informs the National Socialist destruction and genocide of people in Africa, but also in other parts of the world. So this is a kind of an unspoken issue today in Germany, even today. And taking on an anthropology museum in Frankfurt, I noticed immediately that there was no way that I could really engage with questions related to the Jewish museums in Germany. It was like they were kept very much apart. So the idea of a colonial Holocaust has been barely debated. It's being debated today and in the last couple of years because of the Humboldt Forum, but generally speaking, these things are kept separate. The Germans already had set up trading posts in the 15th century. They had a trading post called Little Venice in Venezuela. The colonial museums, I call them ethnocolonial museums, in Germany have a lot more than the British or the French or even the Dutch or the Belgians. This is because very early on, prior to the entry of Germany in colonialism, they were collecting. And then when the colonial period began, they really started collecting. Okay, so you have today, because of federalism, you have approximately 20 museums of ethnology in Germany. If you go into Wikipedia and you look them up, they are vainglorious enough to write down how many objects they own. And if you tot that up, you realize that there are easily 4 million, if not more, objects that belong to Southeast Asia, including the whole kind of Sepik area, Papua New Guinea, highly desired in Germany, the African continent, America from the north to the south, from the tip to Patagonia, but also, so what have I forgotten? Latin America, Oceania, Africa, Southeast Asia. And why did they collect so much? They collected so much because they had two objectives in mind. Number one, they wanted to produce further scientific theory. Number two, they wanted to inform citizens of what was happening in the other parts of the world, so that at the moment that you get the development of tourism in the 1840s, the steamships that are crossing the Atlantic, the construction of department stores all over Europe, right? From Galeries Lafayette through to all of these department stores, you at the same time have the production and the construction of anthropological museums, ethnological museums. And there is, in the case of Frankfurt, a particularly interesting development in that the man who founded the museum in 1904, he was a doctor in Sumatra, and he was informed by racial theory, so that's another story. He created a collection of extremely unpleasant photography out there in Sumatra, using the fact that there were migrant workers to create a comparative analysis of the human body and human genitalia. We discovered this hidden in the museum when I worked there in 2010. But he believed, and this was the greatest, this hasn't in a way really left the discussion. He believed that museums were there to develop trade, right? And so the Ethnological Museum was, if you like, a university for traders. That's where they would understand how people eat, how they build, how they extract minerals, everything. And whilst these museums were being built in Germany and in France and also in Britain, with the British Museum and many more, Manchester, Liverpool, they all had museums. Oddly enough, what people don't realize is that there were colonial museums being built on the African continent. So I think the first colonial museum on the French side is 1868 in Saint-Louis du Sénégal on the Mauritanian border. And this museum was there to show the beauties of colonial culture, right? Or information about the colonies, but also to inform the Europeans who had gone out there and needed to know about where they had landed, in what part of the world they had landed, and also to provide a bit of tourism.
It's quite interesting because now we're sort of intersecting all these topics of like colonialism and then also capitalism, but also mobility. And it's all coming together, and like you're sort of like quite nicely drawing a whole map of the intersections of like different narratives and topics, which I think like in general in this discourse is sort of neglected.
Yeah, it's well, we'll come back to that when we talk about the present, because not much has changed, unfortunately. It's still about cultural politics in Europe vis-a-vis other areas of exploitation.
Would you like to also maybe say something about the British collection while we're on it? Because I think...
Well, it's the British Empire, remember. It's not British colonialism, it's empire. It's now Commonwealth, but the Commonwealth. Well, that really has been, I guess, extremely important in the sense that it's there that we have the famous case of the Benin Bronzes. And the tons and tons, I think it was 300 tons of Benin Bronzes that were removed from the palace in Benin City and brought back to Britain. Just like you have the Elgin marbles which haven't been returned, right? So you have this idea of the Universal Museum, which begins in the 18th century really with the Enlightenment, and then continues today with a kind of a new version of the Universal Museum. And I think what is important to give it a kind of contemporary slant is that today in the discussion on restitution, which we need to talk about, the British are being terribly quiet because they have an additional problem. They have class. They have a class society. So when they start to talk about restitution, they're not just talking about questions of ethnicity or race or minority cultures or any of those labels that they like to use. They've also got a problem with the interconnection between a cultural understanding of the other and a class understanding of the other.
Very interesting, thank you. Because we were talking about the collections and you were saying you're like sort of moving between terms of anthropology and ethnology.
Yes.
And some of these collections are being called ethnographic.
Yes.
Could you elaborate this term, what ethnographic means?
Yes. So when I studied anthropology in the 1980s, what became clear is that there was a huge competition between different institutes. The Germans were considered historicists. The British would have been functionalists. So, for example, whilst the French were amassing thousands of objects in the 1930s, the British were very sort of haughty about it and said, no, we don't do that. We do individual participant observation, right? We send out a lonely anthropologist, usually a man, but it could be a woman like Margaret Mead. They live with the culture, they come back, they write the anthropology or the ethnology. The ethnographic is effectively what happens out in the field. Yeah? The ethnological is the logos, the apparatus, the discursive apparatus. What is problematic in all this is that it pushes the question of ethnicity to the forefront. Okay? So even today, the division, the classifications, the taxonomies of collections in these museums are based on notions of ethnicity, of ethnic groupings. And so even until today, the presentations of museums, new exhibitions will be about the Luba, about the Bakongo, about the Igbo, about the Yoruba people. And that's how these collections were constructed. They were constructed on the one hand through a kind of a very, very strange, slightly perverse and obsessive desire to find out what we don't know about life. In other words, everything that was the most ritualized, the most mystical, was of course the most interesting. It interested the missionaries. But at the same time, because they had to educate the citizens back in Germany or France or Britain, it was important to bring back everything that you lived with, right? So that you could show then, even recreating some ghastly hut, right? You could show exactly how these people lived. And it's very interesting that today, in a newspaper article, I think it came out 1 or 2 days ago, one of the initiators of the notorious Humboldt Forum, Horst Bredekamp, spoke about the current debates of the decolonial debates at the moment, which he would call post-colonial, that they were actually the most anti-colonial debates, that actually they were hindering the Humboldt Forum and its tradition of being anti-colonial. And he says in it that normal everyday objects of use for people living in the different parts of the world where these objects were plundered, that these were for Germans epistemological clues, clues to knowledge, erkenntnistheoretische Objekte. And this tells you just how insidious the collecting and the classification, the ordering, and the control over other cultures actually was, right? So on the one hand you could say, we can take your things because it's everyday objects, and the moment they're back in Europe you begin to want to construct a story around them. And this is, I think, one of the key aspects, if you don't mind me continuing, to the question of collections. Who took them? Yeah. They were taken by missionaries. In the case, for example, of Nigeria, in southern Nigeria, near Benin, right, Benin City, you had missionaries who would animate local Nigerian movements, encouraging them to destroy idols, fetishes, ritual objects. And you would have, maybe in some cases, you would have 4,000 of them that would be brought, piled up in a mound, and then before you knew it, the colonial director of the museum in Lagos, Kenneth Murray or others, would be phoned up and say, look, we're just about to destroy a lot of objects, do you want them? We're going to throw them in the river, we're going to burn them, come and take them. So there is a complex interconnection between the advocacy of Christianity, of evangelism, of iconoclasm, right, of destruction, destroying one's own cultural heritage, and the obsessive, the cult of possession of the European museum.
And now a very provocative question. So whose objects are they? Because if now Western or European countries have these objects and some other national governments want these objects back, what is the term of having your options back is the key question, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difference between proprietorship and ownership, or possession and ownership. So in my opinion, this has to be seen in relationship to the scale and the volume of material that is in Europe. If there are up to 4 million artifacts in Germany alone, a lot of them are not the iconic artworks, the ritual objects, the major pieces of, in quotes, tribal art. A lot of them are things that people live with, objects of virtue, because they fulfill a particular part of life and they're loved for that reason, they're used. It can be clothing, it can be architecture, it can be engineering, right? Which today are sequestered alongside all the other artifacts. And these were often collected in doubletten, in doubles. So if I went out, for example, the Frankfurt Museum went out with taxpayers' money in the 1960s, can you believe it, right? It didn't have a museum. The museum building had been bombed in the Second World War, but it decided to go out and quickly salvage anthropology, Rettungsethnologie, to save everything it could and bring it back to Germany before the cultures died out. Right?
In the 1960s, that's
We're
not that long ago.
We're talking late 1960s, and you know what's going on in the 60s. There's a lot happening, independence in African countries, right? Lots of stuff going on in the States around black power, etc. But this is going on, you know, it's good, it's important, we need to do this. So why did they bring back so many of one type of artifact? Why did they bring back, for example, 150 bridal headdresses and not one? It's because they swapped between museums in Germany. So that if the director went to the Sepik River in Papua New Guinea and another one went to the Congo, if you didn't have a swapping system, then no museum could be encyclopedic, right? They would have holes. And it's always this idea of we need to represent the world, except of course Europe and the civilized, you know, areas like Asia, China. This is all part of civilization, but ethnology looks at other cultures, and you know, for that you still need to have this kind of vision of the whole world, which is impossible, right? So the plundering and the looting whether it was done by gift, whether it was done by purchase, whether it was done by legacy, doesn't matter. The vast amount of material that was removed from these places was removed in a kind of serial kleptomania. It wasn't just one piece, right? It was mass expeditions. Now, what's clear about this is that when they were out in those areas, they did not write down the name of the author, the artist, the craftsperson, the engineer, the architect, the guild, nothing. They didn't even photograph the objects in situ, because anything like that would have made the person, the seller, slightly wary about maybe even giving it away. Why do they want to know so much about this, right?
But it also gives like some sort of autonomy to the one who's taking it, in sense of putting it the label as this is an art, like an arts object, for example.
No, it just meant that if they had found out too much in the field, A, they would have come back with less, B, it would have taken longer, and C, what would they have done back in Germany? They needed to photograph it in Germany, and they needed to write about it. And it was the German museum anthropologists who wrote about other cultures. And this is still with us today, this authority of anthropology, the monocultural aspect of anthropology, which very much like a plantation, an intellectual plantation, operates to exclude polycultural interpretations, multidisciplinary approaches, and insists on knowing how best to represent the context of these particular artifacts.
Oh, thank you. And now thinking about the whole moving of objects in their places, how does this process of restitution work? Can you give us some examples, maybe?
Yes, I mean, look, something very important happened when in 2017, in November, in Ouagadougou, President Emmanuel Macron declared at the university in Ouagadougou that he was going to do something about the fact that these objects, in his words, were prisoners. He used the word prisoners. And that these prisoners needed to be returned, and that he would make everything possible for this to happen. The effect is minimal. Everybody in the world is waiting, in particular the Nigerians are waiting for 26 objects to be returned to Benin City. I was in Benin City exactly 1 year ago. The Oba of Benin City, the kind of a group of Nigerians, have asked Sir David Adjaye, right, the Tanzanian Ghanaian architect, to build a new structure for a new museum to house 26 objects. But what about the hundreds, if not thousands, of other objects that are still lying in wait, dormant, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a long, long process. The effects of restitution are very important. There's no denying that these artifacts have to be returned. As Achille Mbembe quite rightly states, if you already have negotiations with nation states in Africa, then you have to do it on every level, not just on economic levels. You have to allow the nation state, even if you don't approve of it, to take on the heritage and the legacy and to do what it wants with it. It's not good enough to say they don't have good conservators, they don't have ACs. It's not the problem of the European Museum to decide how the returned, restituted artifacts should be looked after. It's really not.
And I think this is one of the most important things that people also sort of forget about, that when something is being returned, the European institution also demands how the object should be stored and how it should be returned. Yes. And you know, exposed where it goes to.
Yes, but what you actually find, you find two problems with the restitution issue, not as per se, not at all, right? This is absolutely untouchable. But what you have is a kind of internal European proxy arguments using restitution to kind of bolster the cultural ministries in different countries, right? So Monica Grütters here will promote provenance, right? Object biographies, the historicization of everything that was not recorded at the time, remember?
Can you quickly, maybe just quickly say what what you mean by provenance research?
Well, it's you know, just as like 2 or 3 years ago, you could look at all these 20 museums in Germany and say, aha, a generation is leaving, right? And effectively, you don't need to worry that they're taking away a lot of material with them, a lot of knowledge, because the knowledge comes from books. These are armchair museum anthropologists. So it's quite relatively easy reading to find out how to interpret these objects from the Eurocentric perspective of the anthropologist, okay? Or the ethnographic perspective. Provenance studies means that you try and do a bit of work on where they actually came from. You go back into the cellar, you uncover, you open the boxes where there might be a document registered by a colonial administrator which says that the Herr von XYZ picked up this object and paid so and so much for it. And this kind of provenance is both to assure restitution or not, right? But it's also to kind of come, it's in a way it's legitimizing museum anthropology just when we thought it might be handed over to a different type of infrastructure. So it's provenance studies is necessary. We need to know more about the artifacts, but it needs to happen in the countries of origin, doesn't it?
Of course.
You mentioned, or I'd like to just bring on the question of human remains.
Exactly, that's what I wanted to get to now.
And I'd like to explain to you also how the monocultural, the tight barriers around anthropology can be broken by other disciplines. I mean, in my opinion, you need to bring people from law, architecture, economy, ecology, from different cultures, from the source community, but they need to come together to look at these collections and develop new ideas around them. In other words, it's not possible for us today in 2021 to perform a decolonial art history without access to these sequestered collections. Otherwise, it's just blah, blah. Yeah? And these collections are in bunkers. They're difficult to look at. I want to give you an example of a Fijian, a New Zealand artist called Luke Willis Thompson, and how he dealt with the question of human remains. I invited him to the museum. He selected artifacts. He brought them into the special space that we had created in order for guests to reinterpret these artifacts, to remediate them. And he picked up a particular object which was made out of a human skull from, I think if I remember right, New Ireland. And it's a skull that a dancer wears. It has, it's embellished, and it has a piece that between the jawbones so that the performer bites it and wears it. He looked at this skull for 3 weeks, regularly, ritually, every day. And at the end of the day, he said, okay, so I would like you to give the fee that I receive as a guest artist, the materials budget. I want to give it to somebody who needs to repatriate a person who has just died in Frankfurt. Okay? So the museum, considered by politicians as the multicultural place par excellence, for the first time, the museum had to find an interlocutor, an agent in Frankfurt, who would be aware of the needs for a person who had come to Frankfurt either in exile or because they had a menial job or a task, and they would not be, and one of the kin or friends had died. And as people, I think, can be aware, you can't just get buried in Germany. You don't have the right to be buried in Germany. So we found eventually an imam who had been responsible for setting up one of the largest social organizations for Muslim people in the Hessen region. And Luke Willis Thompson went to see him and he said, I want to give you these, I think it was 1,500 euros, towards the transportation of the corpse back to a country, ideally that is reflected in our collection, so say Africa. The imam said, okay, that's interesting, but what do you want in exchange? And he said, I'd like a documentation of the family or the person, just a memento mori, if you like. That's all I ask for, and I'd like to be able to exhibit it, together with a certificate from the museum saying that we have handed over the money for the purposes of repatriation of effectively human remains. Okay? So this happened. And in the end, we exhibited the skull, the certificates, and interestingly, the photographs of the imam's son, who had had a chronic disease and could not be repatriated back to Egypt because he had been born in Germany. So when members of the public, your normal punters who go to museums, when they walked into the installation of Luke Willis Thompson, they suddenly saw something that made the repatriation of human remains totally contemporary. It was about, hold on a minute, Frankfurt, the most international city in Germany. People come and work. It's buzzing with different cultures, even more cultures than in Berlin. But we don't know what happens to them when they die, do we? We have no idea. We don't follow this. We don't have if you like, a duty of care to these people. And so I think that on the one hand, the question of the return of human remains from the past is it's like the most important thing. There is nothing ever that should stop people from having the remains sent back with respect, back to whomever one can find as the receiver, right? But it's also important to have other voices come in and break the mold of this idea of restitution and look at it with a perspective that is seriously contemporary. And that's what certain artists can do. This is not a kind of a cosmetic intervention. This is really goes right into the root of the discourse on restitution.
And do you think that this is how museums could do better on the question of objects?
Look, for 10 years now, 5 years in the museum where I did it on a small laboratory scale, workshop scale, to the last 5 years I've been writing manifestos that ask for the right of access to sequestered artifacts, colonial artifacts that are being held in ethnocolonial museums in Europe. I fundamentally believe that museums need to change. They've gone into a hyper-consumerist mold. People go into a museum, they walk, they look at things as if they were swiping over a screen. They are forced to go quite fast. It's considered an act of sedition if you spend too long in front of an artwork. In the British Museum, I interviewed a porter or an invigilator. He said that he had one chair to sit on, poor guy, and that people were having panic attacks. They were fainting. They couldn't handle this kind of bulimia of we need to stuff ourselves with more culture, with more exhibitions, etc. And then when we've seen that, we'll go to the cafe and then we'll go and buy some craft, right? We'll go to the shop. This idea of the museum is actually quite vulgar. It throws us straight back to what I was talking about, the department store, the emporium. Yeah. What we need today is a museum university. Universities are becoming more and more gated. Look at the Academy in Exile. Yeah? Where are the students that can't get into the universities in Europe? Where are the professors who are in exile who cannot teach here in Germany? Why aren't they being given positions? Even, they can be authorities on exactly the subjects that people want to study today, and yet because of some kind of exams or some kind of bureaucracy, some kind of dreadful academia, they don't even get there. Now, the museum is the only place today that you don't have to show an exam paper in order to teach or to transmit knowledge. So if you were to lift from their debasement the artifacts that have been removed through colonialism into the museum spaces, which are huge. The Humboldt Forum is whatever, 40,000 square meters, right?
It's a huge palace in the middle of the city.
It's a huge construction. To lift them up and to design, naturally you need to design it. You need architects to design areas where university level information, research, education, rigorous education, can take place inside the museum on the basis of these collections. This is what I think is important. I don't believe that we can work entirely with the digital. We need the digital. We need to be able to take a fish trap, okay, from Papua New Guinea or from Africa, look at it and say, wow. We don't want to recreate a fish trap, but we want to look at the way that the water flow operates, because it's incredibly intelligent, and this live wire of ingenuity can be today, in the case of a museum university, reconfigured so that eventually a new artifact is produced, a new object, a new object of survival perhaps, particularly relevant to the ecological times in which we live, and then can be patented by the person who has invented it. So in some ways it would be an indirect way of returning both respect and copyright back to the cultures whose artifacts were effectively plundered. So the option of bringing these artifacts out of the cellar, creating a museum with tables, chairs, digital equipment, a whole kind of university that would be based on visual analysis, that would be multidisciplinary, multicultural, that would allow students who can't get into other colleges to learn through looking, to learn through analysis, to bring an artifact from Africa, place it next to an artifact from Germany, look at it, question it, right? Not reduce it back to issues of ethnicity, which are not a good idea, as we know in Germany, right? To try and create a space for the future diasporic student body that is already here and that has nowhere to go, effectively, right? So I think that there is, the question is, you know, restitution, as you asked me, it's a slow process. 26 objects going back, one sabre returned to Senegal last year or the year before. It's irrelevant, it's relic diplomacy. So whilst this relic diplomacy is taking its pace very slowly, like a snail, something has to happen with the material that is in Europe. And the problem we have is that whilst you have a few artists who make work around it, from Kader Attia, Luke Willis-Thompson, there are quite a few people who are voicing these concerns, whilst you have academics meeting to discuss how best to restitute, you also have the second watershed movement, which is 2020 and Black Lives Matter. And I think that this issue of the decolonial is the only way that we can begin to insist upon not only the access to these artifacts, but the breaking down of colonial disciplinary divisions. Who cares about putting art history here and ethnology here? What sense does it make? It's not interesting. It's
a very strong German tradition, though, to distinguish between disciplines and not become interdisciplinary.
Yes, but that is colonialism.
Yeah. And
it is also part of the racist underpinnings of museums. And there is no reason for it. When I was art student in the late 70s, I was the only foreigner in an art academy in Vienna. Today, you go and find one person who believes that if they go to a German art academy, they're going to become a German artist? No. 70% of the students are from all over the place. They've studied in many locations, right? This, of course, in the current political situation with the British are you know, destroying Erasmus at the moment, so the movement of British students in Europe will be stopped. So there's a counterflow that is necessary, and that has to come from students. It has to come from the younger generation, because my generation, and maybe even yours, is embroiled in a kind of academicization of political urgency, okay? And that doesn't get us anywhere.
I agree, and I think this is a very nice way of sort of closing this very fruitful and beautiful conversation, thinking about young students watching this and maybe also finding some inspiration and some motivation.
Spend as much, all I can say is spend as much time in a museum. It's heated, it has lighting, You don't need to pay to get into all of them. Use it as your place of study. Spam the hang. You know, with the Metabolic Museum University that I did in Ljubljana, we created chairs for the members of the audience that had small beamers on them and a table so you could put your laptop, and you could spam, you could project your own thing, whether it came from Facebook or Instagram or the newspaper. You could spam it in between the paintings that were hung on the walls, right? And likewise, you know, you can use the museums as a location to teach. Sure. And even if it's only out of the corner of your eye, like for me today, I've checked out that you've got a Rothko on the wall. I've been looking at everything that's going on, but I wasn't asked to, okay? And it's that indirect modus of knowledge transmission that is possible in a museum.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for this interview. This has been
thank you.
On so many levels.
The Academy
so
in Exile is excellent. Yeah.
Thank you. So maybe we can quickly just go back to the question of restitution and how the process of restitution works.
Yes.
Maybe you can give us one more example.
Yeah. So as I said, the question of Europe dealing with restitution is and the United States, it's all fine and well, you know, we see more and more, it's become a kind of dinner table conversation, right? People now know what restitution is. But a year ago I went to Nigeria, invited by the African Artists Foundation to do research with the foundation on restitution. So I was curious, you know, in Nigeria there are 66 official national museums and over 30 private museums. I wanted to know what the curators thought about restitution. I wanted to understand what they already had. I wanted to talk to normal people, not just academics, about the question of restitution. So we got the support of the NCMM, the National Council of Museums and Monuments, and we traveled to around 10 museums. It was just before Corona, so we didn't have a lot of time. And we realized afterwards that we wanted to do a project around the home. That if you want to get it, that actually there was no real conversation going on around restitution. It was being imported into the African continent via discussions that were happening in the States or in Europe. But there wasn't really, apart from a few academics in South Africa, in Cape Town, with Siraj Rasool, or in a sort of a handful of people who were pushing it, but they were still pushing it within academia. But what did normal people think? So we decided, in the context of a festival called Lagos Photo, also run by the African Artists Foundation, to send out an open call in 10 languages, including, by the way, Russian and Chinese, but Swahili, Yoruba, Igbo, French, German, different languages, which was written like a letter to a friend. You know, hope you're okay in these troubled times. We're interested to know if you are thinking of the objects of virtue that you might have in your home, how your home could be a museum. And it went a little bit viral, so it didn't remain within the African continent. It went right out to Saudi Arabia, Iran, China, Russia, and we got 240 responses. The brief was very simple. You take your phone, any kind of camera, you take between 6 to 12 photographs of your objects of virtue, and you write a text explaining to us why, okay? And what came in was extraordinary. First of all, it was too early for us to think about Corona, about the fact that people were stuck at home. But hey, this was remarkable because everybody, me too, I was also reconfiguring my flat and looking at my objects of virtue and value, things I hold dear to my heart. And so the material came in, and it is extraordinary because it is over 2,000 photographs of things which doesn't matter if you're in China or if you're in Nigeria or Ghana or Iran. There are many objects which people are collecting and that signify the 20th century. It can be technology, it can be vintage photographs of the family, it can be objects, souvenirs, memoriam, you know, all this kind of stuff. The writing around it that people sent in is nothing like a museum label could ever be. It doesn't operate with this hideous and ultimately racist reductionism, ethnic group, function. It's people's stories. So we asked students at the Hamburg Academy, in other words, the younger generation, to construct a digital museum for the home. Because if I had done it, again, or people my generation, the likelihood that we would have unavoidably taken a colonial matrix of a museum and superimposed it within the digital was very likely. And so in the end, if you go to homemuseum.net, you will see that for anybody who wants to look at the home museum, you have a way of looking. You can just follow your eyes and you can wander through the different propositions. You have the texts, but you don't have the gender, you don't have the age, you don't have the nationality of the people who provided the material. So it goes, I mean, the majority are not professional photographers. And this has generated a conversation about restitution. And the key to it is that this is not stuff that's been stolen. Restitution implicates or suggests that something has been removed that you want. So when you begin the discussion of restitution from the point of view of what you have, and not from a dimension of loss, it's a different, if you like, notion of affect and recognition that comes into play, that starts to operate. And this is important. It's not, they took something away, I don't know about it, but they took it away, I want it back. It's, I have a museum at home, I am proud of what I have, and now let's see what you can send us. Yeah, it's an inclusive, co-created museum of the commons.
It's non-essentialistic.
Yeah.
It's very transnational. Yeah. Great. Wow, thank you very much. This has been a very nice example also of like practicing ideas.
Maybe you can even bring in homemuseum.net.
Sure.
It's very easy to use, and it was incredible to just see how. And of course, the only, okay, we have an alphabet, an A to Z, but we didn't create any classification between the entries. And when we decided not to include nationality, that was a big step, and that was the students.
Because it's not relevant.
It's not relevant, no.
Yeah. Thank you.